Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to ITRL's breakfast webinar, the first for this season. As you may know, if you've been at our previous webinars, we have webinars on a range of topics, all concerning transport in some way and the future of transportation. And we try to use different types of seminars for each time. Last, we talked about battery recycling, for example, and today we will talk about policy acceptance. But before we get started, I would like to talk about some ground rules for our webinars. First of all, is that you please keep your microphone muted until we give you permission to speak, so to say. You can use the raise hand feature if you wish to ask questions. We will mostly have questions in the end today, but if there's anything you're uncertain of or if you don't understand, then you can use either the raise hand feature or the chat feature in Zoom, or you can post questions, which I will bring up when I think that it's relevant. Please keep your camera turned off as well during the seminar. We do have several upcoming webinars, nothing that's been decided on at this point, but we do have regular webinars about once a month or once each other month. So if you're interested in joining more seminars, you can just go to itrl.kth.se/events to watch previous seminars and then sign up as well for our newsletter where we cover upcoming events for webinars. You can also follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn if you're interested. Today, we welcome Sverker Jagers, who is a professor in political science at the University of Gothenburg. And the reason why we're inviting Sverker is that I was actually at the National Transport Conference Transportforum 3 years ago, and I heard the welcoming speeches there, where Sverker had, I think, a pretty brief, maybe 10 minutes, talking about this type of research and talking about, okay, it's not just about what we need to do when it comes to environmental issues, it's actually about how we do this. And the kind of question is like, how can we avoid these yellow vests? How can we actually enforce policy that people want as well, and that people can feel some sort of acceptance for? I think the sort of in the news cycle today is a lot about the gasoline prices being really high at this point, which kind of as a transport researcher, I think that, okay, this is awesome. This is just what we want. And I think that I can speak for a large part of the transport research community when we say that, yeah, this is pretty good. But the kind of I do understand that this impacts people's everyday life and that not everyone who actually wants this. And we do hear talks about from different parties that they actually want to lower the taxes on gasoline, for example. So the kind of question that we're interested in here, and I hope that Sverker will give us some insight into, is how do we actually get acceptance for these pretty, I'd say, sometimes tough political decisions that need to be taken. So Sverker will talk about this today, and he will speak for roughly 30 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for questions, and if you have any remarks that you want to give as well. But use the raise hand feature then, or type in the chat, and I will bring up the whatever remarks or questions that you have. But with that said, I hand over to Sverker.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining this seminar. We'll see if I can share my screen here. Do you see this?
Yes, looks great.
Excellent. Well, I will talk about policy acceptance today. I will say less maybe how exactly to avoid. avoid yellow vests, but more what need to be thought about in order to avoid these reactions, because in the end of the day, it's pretty much an issue for politicians to decide more exactly how to carry out our environmental policies. I think it's interesting to go back to 2018. Start there. Because in that year, both France tried to increase their carbon dioxide tax, and Canada implemented a national carbon dioxide tax the same year. And in France, we had these heavy reactions from the public, or at least from various groups in society, or some groups. While in Canada, they actually managed to implement a tax where it was promised that this tax will gradually be increased over time. How come that they failed in France and succeeded in Canada? I will return to this in the end, and if I don't, please remind me to bring up this issue again, or this topic. Let me give you some background first. If we look in the literature and in the normative debate about the environment and how to cope with environmental problems, you find one strand of literature and arguments saying that we want the most effective policies possible to avoid environmental problems from arising, and to make the world better. So the more successful, the more effective, the stronger the policies, the better. These arguments are typically coming from people who are strongly environmentally concerned and engaged. Another strand of literature sort of agree that the more effective the better, but the policies should be as cost efficient as possible. Start with the low-hanging fruits, and then to make calculations on sort of the policies that will cost society the least. And those arguments are typically coming from economists, environmental economists. And I would say that many of the suggestions of environmental policies, not only when it comes to climate, but to the environment more in general, have been influenced by these two sort of core arguments, and perhaps mostly sort of the cost efficiency arguments. So taxes, environmental taxes, are very popular suggestions on how to cope with environmental problems of various kinds. But and when it comes to climate, of course, carbon dioxide taxes. What's interesting is that despite the fact that the academic literature has been that taxes have been so much defended by academia, despite this, we see very few countries in the world who have carbon dioxide taxes. So for some reason, these optimal policy instruments are not very easy to implement. And a reason for this, I think, is the third leg in the equation, which has been much less considered, which has to do with legitimacy and how various groups in society perceive these suggested policies and policy instruments, and whether they are willing to legitimize, to sort of give their support to these suggestions, policy suggestions. Legitimacy, if we look at that theoretically, which we shouldn't, at least not today, but at least I want to mention that the degree to which people or actors are legitimizing, in this case, a policy, can be sort of divided into different groups. So on the one hand, you can think of legitimacy and the legitimization of policies if there is support, active support for a certain policy. That if enough people or a majority are supporting a policy, then it's likely that it will be implemented. And some have argued that we should, or politicians and decision makers should try to generate this full support among a majority in order to have the policy implemented. But very few people, if we make survey studies, for example, or interviewing people, quite few people are actually supporting a policy or give it full support. It's a very strong demand. So many people can rather accept policies to sort of give full support. It requires both that you are convinced that the environment need to be saved at basically any cost, and also that you give support to the political party who is sort of driving this policy. And as we know, in Sweden we have many parties, and you could be environmentally engaged but not necessarily support, for example, the Green Party. Studies have shown that it might be enough that people accept a policy to make it possible to have it implemented. And acceptance could be generated by many factors that I will talk more about. And it opens up for many more triggers that can be used in order to increase acceptance compared to support. And for some groups in society, they don't give full support, they not even accept a policy, they just consent with the policy. So if others accept and if others adhere to a policy, some people just follow the stream and do the same. So we should be aware that sort of this third component, legitimacy, could concern various aspects. And if we look in the literature, you see that many articles and many studies on this legitimacy aspect of the equation is about support, or at least that's in the titles, sort of public support for a certain policy. But if you look at the questions being used when analyzing this question, it's often more about acceptance and consent rather than whether people actually give full support to the suggested policies. Anyway, today I will talk about acceptance. Pretty much, and I should also say that in my own research I have been blurry, and in some articles the title has support in it. So rather than acceptance, but I try to avoid that nowadays, having sort of thought about this a bit more. Anyway, so simply let's focus on acceptance today. And why should we do that? I think there are several reasons, and I will give you two here. First of all, if there is low or no acceptance, it's very difficult for politicians to force through and manage to implement policies that might be needed for the environment. So we have electoral cycles, and the closer you come to the election, the less bold politicians dare to be. They are afraid to lose voters. So, for example, I can imagine that as you started to talk about, Eric, the price on fossil fuels will probably be one of the topics for this year's election. And we can see now how parties who previously have actually signed and argued for increased prices on fossil fuels now come with suggestions that we should lower the price. We should lower the tax and so forth, in order to with the hope that will sort of generate more voters and more votes in the elections in September. But also, as we could see in France, if there isn't enough acceptance, there are risks that it will be more substantial reactions, riots even. Less likely in Sweden, but in France this is sort of more of a tradition that if groups in society, not the least farmers, are unhappy with the policy, they tend to be very expressive in their reactions. And politicians want to avoid this at any cost, or most cost. Another reason for acceptance, public acceptance, is once the policies have been implemented, you want these policies to be complied with, because the more people try to avoid the policies, the more costly they become. In order to monitoring that everyone is actually complying, and if they're not complying, you need to convince them that they should comply, and that is very costly. So acceptance is important. So going through the literature, there is by now a rather extensive literature on what factors are causing acceptance, but maybe more so what factors are decreasing acceptance. And this literature has been run by psychologists in particular, but also sociologists, political scientists, economists, and some other disciplines have been engaged in this topic, and I am among those scholars. So I would like to give you a brief overview of the main factors that we see affect acceptance. So first of all, we have psychological factors, things like people's values. If you are more altruistic and more sort of global in your value orientation, that increases probability for policy acceptance, compared to if you're more egoistic and you value self-enhancement aspects of life. Another factor is ideology. So typically, but this is not a general pattern, but in many countries, not the least in Sweden, we see that the more left-oriented you are, the more likely that you will support environmental policies. But on the other hand, the more left-oriented you are, the more likely that you will support any interventions from the government with the population. So it's not necessarily linked to the environment. And of course, we also have this more green-gray scale, that the more environmentally concerned you are, the more likely that you support pro-environmental policy instruments, or you accept them. Beliefs is another group of factors that psychologists have identified. And beliefs it's a very broad category of factors. So it's both factors that are very closely linked to values. Things like if you believe that the environment is worth saving, that psychologists talk about a pro-environmental worldview, that you have the environment in focus when you create beliefs about the world. But there are also more concrete beliefs, such as whether you think that the environment is threatened, if you're concerned about the health of the environment, and also if you are aware of the consequences of society's way of working and actions being made in society. If you believe that what we do today have negative consequences for the environment, which are more specific beliefs. Whether a certain technology is beneficial or not for the environment, for example, or a technological system. Both values and beliefs have been shown to very much influence people's personal norms, basically guiding principles how I think I should behave in a certain situation. So personal norms, it's guiding principles for how to behave, and those are personal, and they can differ from one person to another. So when you go and you shop your toothpaste, for example, whether you have norms saying that you should go for the cheapest price, or if you go for the most pro-environmental alternatives, for example. This is determined by what personal norms you carry, and they can change over time, much easier than, for example, values that at best change over a lifespan. So therefore, psychologists have been more interested in sort of how can various interventions change people's personal norms. So that's closer to action, so to speak. And sociologists and political scientists have been more concerned with what we can call interpersonal or institutional factors. So it has been shown that the more I trust others, social trust, that has impact on whether people accept policies or not, and not necessarily in a positive way. Many studies have shown that the higher my social trust, the less likely that I will support or accept policies. And we have tried to explain this finding in the following way, that if I trust that others will change their behavior voluntarily, then those policies are not needed, and therefore I will be less likely to accept them. Another factor which we find constantly has a positive effect on acceptance is political and institutional trust. So the more high trusting I am in the political system, in political parties, in political institutions, but also in implementing institutions. So sort of the public administration, the more likely that I will accept the policies. And that makes sense, right? If I have trust in those institutions designing and implementing the policies, it's more likely that I will accept them. And this, I think, has very, very important policy implications if we look in a broader perspective than Sweden, because Sweden is one of the most high trusting countries in the world when it comes to political and institutional trust. So it's if we should expect policies to be, or policy instruments to be implemented anywhere in the world, it should be in Sweden and the Scandinavian countries. While in countries where you have large problems with corruption and transparency and rule of law and so forth, it's much less likely that not the least market-based policy instruments will be implemented, or will be accepted, at least. Another factor which we share with psychologists is what we call social norms. And that's basically what I think that others expect of me when it comes to behavior, and how I perceive that others are behaving. So if I am joining a group where I perceive that the norm is that I should act pro-environmentally, or that I should accept a policy instrument, it's very likely that this will have spillover effects on myself, because I want to be part of this social community, and then I try to sort of adjust my behaviors so that they fit with the rest of the group. And social norms have been shown to have a very, very strong effect on at least behavior, but we think also for policy acceptance, and we are just in the start of conducting more systematic studies how social norms can also affect policy acceptance. Now we come to the, I think, most important type of factors, and they are very, very closely linked to the policy instruments per se. We call them policy-specific beliefs. And that is, it has less to do with whether I'm environmentally concerned or not. It has more to do with what I think about the specific policy instrument. And I think this is very important research in order to understand how come that so many obviously clever policy instruments, such as taxes, are never implemented. It's because people have certain opinions about the tax as such. And when we have studied this more closely, we have found that fairness perceptions is one factor that causes negative levels of acceptance. So if people think that the policy is unfair, either in how it has been designed or in its consequences for society, it's very likely that they will not accept the policy. Another dimension is whether people perceive the policy instrument to be effective or not, have intended effect. The more you think that the policy instrument is well motivated and that it would have intended effect, the more likely that the level of acceptance will increase. And the same to a lesser degree, at least when it comes to the transport sector and fossil fuel taxes, for example, levels of freedom. If people think that my personal freedom will be decreased, or certain groups' freedom in society will be decreased by the implementation of the policy, the levels of acceptance also decreases. And finally, a number of socio-demographics that have shown to have more or less impact on acceptance: age, gender, income, location, and so forth. So if I try to summarize this before I come to my final slide, we can look at it as this. So values tend to impact on people's beliefs, both about their environmental worldview, but also about consequences and what responsibilities people think they have. These beliefs also impact people's personal norms. And psychologists have shown that these factors here, values, beliefs, and norms, have a very strong impact on policy acceptance and pro-environmental behavior in general. And then other research has added to this model things like policy-specific beliefs. And if we have all these factors included in our models, the effects of values, beliefs, and norms are basically disappearing. So much of this is channeled through policy-specific beliefs. And in a sense, this gives hope, because all of these policy-specific beliefs, you can actually do something about the policies in order to compensate for these things. While it's very difficult to compensate for a policy which is not in line with people's values. You can't really you can't begin by changing people's values in order to implement a policy, but you can do very much about people's fairness perceptions and effectiveness perceptions, which I will say something about in the end. And in addition to this, you have things like trust and also social norms and demography. But what we have not known anything about is what matters most. We only see correlations. I mean, this is primarily done with survey studies, some experiments, but mainly survey studies to come up with these sets of factors. And we were interested in seeing, could we say something about what of this that matters most? If we can say that, it would be much easier to give guidelines to decision makers. How should you design your policy instruments in order to increase acceptance? So a couple of years ago, we initiated a meta-analysis of all the studies we could find out there, and to see, is it possible to determine which factors matter most? And don't ask me about the techniques behind this meta-analysis, because I'm not the data scientist in this. It's all the analysis have been made by Magnus Bergqvist at Department of Psychology in Gothenburg. I just came up with the idea, and I wrote sort of the theory and background sections of the and also helped analyzing the results. Anyway, we collected as many articles as we could about policy acceptance related to climate change, mitigation policies, and from a huge set of articles, we diminished the number to a few hundred, and then we sent out requests to all the research groups who were behind these studies, ask for their data sets. And finally, we ended up receiving 89 data sets with studies related to policy acceptance. Together, this amounted to about 120,000 respondents. And the studies were conducted in 33 countries, of which most were done in Europe, something we suspected, we thought we would see too, because this literature, the policy acceptance literature, is very Europe focused, and is very focused on the Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands, Germany, and some in the UK, while there are hardly any studies done in developing countries. And we focused on economic and legal instruments. I need 5 more minutes. Is that okay? Thank you. And we discovered 15 determinants that repeatedly came up in these studies. And if we look at this, the results from the meta-analysis, where we are not only interested in, because here in these studies we know that there are correlations between the determinants and the level of acceptance, but we wanted to see, is it possible to say which factors matter most? And the results were these. By far, the 2 factors that mostly affect acceptance is people's fairness perceptions and also effectiveness perceptions. So the more people think that the policy is fair, either fair in how it has been developed or in its outcome, then the positive effect is above 0.6, which is very strong, at least in our world. So obviously policy-specific beliefs really matters, as we expected. But we also see that climate change evaluations, so pretty much the beliefs that I showed it before, whether you are concerned about the environment, and if you have knowledge about the seriousness of the problem, and so forth. This also matters, but to a lesser degree. But environmental concern or climate concern is, of course, a very strong determinant. We also see that values and ideology matters, and not the least trust, but to a much lesser degree than policy-specific beliefs. And finally, we also see that demographics has a much lesser impact than we thought. We thought, for example, that income would matter a lot. So the sort of the weaker economy that you have, the more likely that you will be negatively have negative attitudes to a tax, for example. But we don't see that effect almost at all. And neither we see any outspoken gender differences in these studies. So if I summarize, and returning to the question where I started, I would say that there are a few learnings from this meta-analysis when it comes to avoiding yellow vests or negative acceptance of policies. And that is, you should consider fairness and effectiveness. And you should inform people, and if not necessarily create worriness among the public, but at least increase knowledge and awareness about the problem. And also, you should consider the degree to which the implementing bodies are trustworthy or not. And as I write here, this is very important signals for decision makers, not only in Sweden but also elsewhere. So as I mentioned before, we have done some studies in high and low trusting societies and in high and low corrupt countries. And it's very obvious that in countries where you have problems with corruption, people are much less supportive to policy instruments that involve anything that has to do with money. They much more prefer law and order policies in those countries, where in low corrupt societies, market-based instruments, both taxes but also subsidies, are much more accepted than law and order policies. And returning to France, well, as you probably know, it has been highlighted that in the end of the day, Macron promised that I will increase the tax and I will use the revenues to lower the wealth tax in France. You can imagine how fair people thought this to be. He sort of increased the price, not the least for those who earn least and live far away from cities. And then he used the revenues to make life even easier for those who are most wealthy in society, instead of reasoning like in Canada, where Trudeau said that I will use the revenues from the tax to create a general tax reduction for all. So he actually paid back all the revenues from the tax, which had a double compensating effect. So both you remove or lower the income effect, the direct sort of income effect of implementing the tax, because people get the money back in the end of the year, but also those who earn the least, who might not even afford to have a car, or they also received some revenues from the tax, or they still received revenues. So it was even a tax adjustment within society, an economic adjustment, which I think was a selling argument and made it possible to implement the tax even in provinces like Alberta, where they had been heavily against anything related to taxes and fossil fuels, since they are producing much of Canada's fossil fuels. So for decision makers, I think this is important input. But then exactly how to design a policy or a policy instrument in a specific country, I think that is pretty much an empirical question. To see which of these factors matter most in, let's say, Belgium or Brazil. Because there are now over 60 countries in the world who are about to implement carbon taxes in one kind of or the other, in order to fulfill their commitments related to the Paris Agreement. So we will see many more countries trying to implement carbon taxes. And the more they listen to this kind of research, I think the more likely that they will be successful in generating enough acceptance to have them implemented. But that's for the future to see if that is true or not. Okay, I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sverker. Really interesting. I'd like to open up the floor for questions, but I think it's a bit interesting to say that you say that, yeah, we actually have all these people who are concerned about the environment. Of course, that is a factor that actually ranks some sort of general support or then acceptance, to be more fair. But that the factors that are actually most affecting acceptance are fairness, and I think also factors that we can change in a sense as well. Yeah. Because of course, I mean, it's pretty hard to change people's overall values.
Yes.
And maybe not necessarily something that we want to as well, I guess, in a sense.
Exactly.
So I think it's really, really interesting. But I'd like to ask a bit about this, then the supporters. What are their roles? If we say that that's just a small percentage of the population who actually support a certain policy. Then.
Yeah. So as I see it, and this has been theorized by other colleagues as well. At least two aspects are linked to support, and one is, let's say that and this is has not only to do with the environment. This is for any policy. But a policy in my world is sort of a goal for a certain sector in society. We should, let's say, the environment should be improved. And then you can design different policy instruments and policy packages which would enable us to reach this goal. So one dimension of support is whether you actually share the idea that this policy should be reached, or this goal should be reached. So if you are not environmentally concerned or environmentally engaged, that decreases the likelihood that you will give support to a policy. But it could be that you are not environmentally engaged, but you are you give support, or you believe in the particular political party arguing for this particular policy or policy instrument. So let's say if you are a social democrat, it's quite likely that you will support and give support to a policy coming from that party, because you support the political party as such, even if you're not environmentally engaged. And this is a slightly weaker form of support compared to if you're both environmentally concerned or engaged and a social democrat in this case. If you are both these things, it's very likely that you will support a policy. But since there are large groups in society who are neither social democrats nor particularly environmentally concerned, that group is much smaller than the group who support the social democrats. You have a very few numbers already. Now, and this is still the largest party. If you instead consider a policy coming from Folkpartiet, the Liberals, even if you both are sharing the goal and you support the Liberals, there will be again very, very few, far from a majority that will give support. Still, so it's usually strategically pointless trying to or wait until you have generated full support among a majority of society. Then we wouldn't see any changes in society, basically. So acceptance has also empirically been shown to often be enough, not necessarily in the environmental arena or area, but in other policy areas. That acceptance among a majority is enough to implement a new policy. But since politicians are scared of losing voters, they of course want largest possible active support for their policies. And therefore, I think that's a reason why we often see politicians adopting a wait and see policy, or that they are not as environmentally active as many in society would wish them to be. But this can be further developed, because we have also seen in studies that politicians are constantly degrading the environmental engagement among the public. They tend to overrate their own environmental engagement and degrade the public's environmental engagement. And empirically, it tends to be the opposite, that people are actually more environmentally engaged than what politicians are. So at least in Sweden. So yeah, this is a big issue.
I see. But I guess that there has to be some sort of role for the active supporters, the the people who really want a carbon tax, for example.
Yes.
I guess some sort of to sort of start a movement of discussing this issue at all. I guess I would assume at least that they have some sort of role.
Of course,
Yeah.
of course, and often the initiatives are coming from groups in society who are convincing a party that they should go for a certain policy. Or have
I think that it's a bit interesting how we actually implemented the congestion charging in Stockholm, which was around, I think, 15 years ago now, where we started with some sort of test first. So there was 1 year of doing some sort of test. And then we had some sort of evaluation of this. I'm not sure what that actually entailed in practice, but I think it was a bit to actually garner some sort of public acceptance. I think that was the general idea, at least, behind it. But I think it's a bit interesting, and now there's, from what I've understood, pretty widespread public support for this as well. Acceptance. I should stop saying support. But I think we'll move on to some questions. Daniel Pargman.
Yes, I turned on my video, but it seems that I don't know why I can't.
It seems fairly dark, but we can hear you at least. Yeah. So please.
Great. So I have a question. Taking this from the national level to a much smaller organizational level. So basically, the Paris Agreement states that we should decrease carbon emissions significantly, and researchers, Stockholm Resilience Center, Rockström, etc., they have formulated the carbon law. We need to decrease carbon emissions by 50% every decade between now and 2050. And the Swedish climate framework for higher education has accepted the Paris Agreement as a goal. So our goal at KTH, our local goal, is to decrease our own carbon emissions by 50%. And I have a project where I look at our flying, and we fly a lot. Basically, every employee has emissions of around 2,000 kilos of carbon emissions per year in their professional role. So I'm thinking about your strategies or your criteria. And you say that people need to be well informed. And I guess that if we're not well informed at KTH, then I don't know who would be. So we should be pretty well informed. And I would imagine that trustworthiness of our organization should be high, that head of school and rector would have the support. So, and as to fairness and effectiveness, since we haven't discussed concrete policies, I guess you could shape them in whatever way people would believe to be fair and effective. So I wondered, what should our policies be, or how should we reason about our own policies to decrease our flying or emissions from flying by 50% in a 10-year period?
Thank you. Well, you see, this is how you should do. A wonderful question, and obviously we are struggling with the same issue at University of Gothenburg, I don't want to come up with any suggestion on exactly how the policy should look, but I think that one should start thinking more in terms of what can be done more on a voluntary basis, and the next step would be to because it's something, I think it's something totally different to make these kind of behavioral changes within a small organization compared to a country, for various reasons. I want to say that with the start, but then start with voluntary alternatives. In the next step, I would go for that you need to argue for why you need to make this travel, because if is implemented, I think many of the sort of habitual traveling will decrease. That you, like me, I don't fly to Stockholm, I go by train, but now during Corona, I had to write to my head of department and argue for why I needed to do traveling during Corona. And with Zoom and other things, it turned out that it was very few occasions where I actually had to travel, where I could cope with the issues over video instead. And I should go for these options before starting to implement more tougher policy instruments, like we have discussed taxes, for example, within the organization, which in my view is pretty bizarre, because we get funding. I don't think that the Swedish research councils are happy to sort of if the money they send to the universities are taxed within the universities, and also what should the money be used for. But if you start considering such sort of more economic policy instruments, I think it's super important that that you have an idea on how this will affect various groups at the university. So it's, I mean, my research portfolio compared to a PhD student, for example, is some parallel, and I can afford, and I don't, so I can afford to pay much higher prices for air traveling compared to a PhD student who might need to you know. A price increase or a carbon tax for a PhD student could result in them not being able to do the travel at all, while for me it's just a few more 1,000 kroner or whatever the price would be. Another aspect is that my research funding is not my personal money. So I don't think that the price mechanism is as effective on me as a research leader, where I have a research budget, compared to my household budget. So there, I think rather make it more difficult to travel, rather than trying to implement some kind of price mechanism, would be my recommendation. Or at least avoid that as long as possible, because it will only have impact on those who have the weakest research budgets.
Okay, thank you very much for the answer. I see that what you say is taxes will not be seen as fair, which was the most important criteria. And
I don't think it makes sense either, because it's not my personal economy that is affected.
Yeah. We totally agree, because we know that 80% of the emissions comes from 20% of the researchers. So it's those researchers that need to fly less, not the PhD.
Force them to convince the university that they actually have to make all this traveling. Would be my. I think that's a good start, at least.
Hey, thank you. I see that we have more questions, but unfortunately we're actually out of time for this seminar, and we need to wrap this up on time. I'd like to thank you, Sverker, for holding this talk. I think it was really interesting, and I think that what we talked about before the seminar was that you really want to reach out to other researchers as well. So if you have questions, please contact Sverker. I hope that's okay, Sverker.
Absolutely. I'm very interested in collaborating with sort of groups who do research on transport, and especially those of you who are interested in policy design, and also to have your kind of input on this. So please contact me if you like.
Yes. So thank you for joining today. I hope all of you had an interesting seminar, and we'll welcome you back to the next seminar, which will be, I think, in a month or two. So thank you for today, and bye.